When Donald Trump walked into Joe Rogan's studio, something extraordinary happened that would change American politics forever. In just 3 hours, this podcast interview drew more viewers than CNN gets in a month. But here's what most people missed. It wasn't just another JRE episode. It was the moment traditional media lost its power. The Washington Post, CNN, and every major network were forced to watch as a podcaster took control of the national conversation. And when Kamala Harris refused to sit with Rogan, well, that decision may have cost her everything. Today we're going to talk about how Joe Rogan reshaped the entire political landscape and why the mainstream media is terrified of what comes next.
Are you the most powerful interviewer on the planet? Or are you the most powerful interview that the planet has ever seen? Because who has a billion of anything?
But let's backtrack a little bit. Kamala Harris and her team were aware they were struggling with young male voters, but still, they turned down the invitation.
The way that Donald Trump learned about this medium, it's actually from his youngest son, Barron Trump, who said to his father, "This is what I listen to."
But Barron Trump knew this would be a good idea for his dad, so he convinced him to go. Trump embraced the opportunity and sat down with Rogan for an unfiltered 3-hour conversation.
Podcaster Logan Paul, the wrestler, Jay, is someone that was on the frontal mind of the youngest Trump. And that was the first podcast Donald Trump did. Raised a lot of eyebrows for people, Jay, saying, why is he doing this?
The result was outstanding. That podcast alone drew over 70 million views across platforms. These numbers crushed traditional media interviews and even presidential debates.
What Barron did, advising his father to take the non-traditional media route, was really an amazing decision by the Trump campaign.
You wouldn't believe how this disrupted the news industry. Major news networks usually dictated the national conversation, but suddenly they found themselves reacting to a podcast. CNN, the New York Times, and the Washington Post were forced to cover Rogan's interview like a major political event. You know why this was a major change in the landscape? It's because these networks are no longer leading discussions anymore.
That was a big deal, being on Oprah's show, the last one. And I was like one of the last shows in that final week. And I said, boy, we've come a long way since that.
What happened to ABC's The View was a proof that their opinions no longer count and their influence are fading away. So now, it's obvious Joe Rogan is in charge. The shift was undeniable. A long-form, unfiltered conversation had become more powerful than primetime news. This wasn't just about one interview, it was a warning sign that the power structure in political media had changed. Rogan, once dismissed as just a podcast host, had more influence than entire networks.
His appearance on this show you're seeing now, this past weekend with Theo Vaughn, that generated 14 million views. And then there's this one on the show, Flagrant, 5 million views. This is a campaign strategy for both campaigns, unlike one that we've really ever seen before.
And if you look at the demographic and the voters that these podcast audiences are reaching, it is playing into the strategy.
Candidates could no longer ignore him. In fact, for the first time, mainstream media wasn't the gatekeeper of political discourse, and that terrified them. Trump's appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience wasn't just another campaign stop, it was a calculated move, and it paid off massively. The format played to Trump's strengths. Long conversations with no scripted questions, no interruptions, unlike what you see in 60 Minutes interviews.
So did he have an impact on the election? Look, I think he probably did. I think he did.
His team recognized something that political strategists were slow to accept, the fact that people now trust independent voices over legacy media. Podcasts weren't just an alternative, they were the main stage. But imagine what Kamala did. Her campaign refused to engage. Instead of facing Rogan's audience, she chose appearances on Call Her Daddy and Club Shay Shay, platforms with pre-packaged, controlled conversations. It was a safe move, but was it a smart one? Democrats have long failed to connect with Rogan's core audience, which includes working class, young male voters who feel disregarded by mainstream politics.
But she had an opportunity to come here when she was in Texas, and I literally gave them an open invitation. She actually reached out when she found out that he was coming on. So their camp reached out to me. So I said, great, I would love to talk to her. But it was very difficult to tie it down.
Avoiding Rogan just extended the gap. While Trump favored long-form chats, Harris relied on sound bites. That decision could have cost her more than just the interview. This move revealed something bigger, the sudden demise of traditional political media. Previously, CNN, the Washington Post, and the New York Times dominated the political narrative. But now Joe Rogan, Theo Von, Sean Ryan, Asmongold, and other popular podcasters and streamers are determining the agenda. Trump and Harris both prioritized podcast appearances over legacy media sit-downs, a move unthinkable just a few years ago. The Washington Post's unwillingness to endorse Harris, the backlash, and a wave of subscription cancellations only reinforced the perception that mainstream media was losing credibility. Even Jeff Bezos, who also owns a media company, The Post, conceded that public trust in mainstream media was declining. What made this even more striking was how mainstream media responded to the podcast. Obviously, they had no choice but to face the reality now. Just pay attention to this.
Now the mainstream media has changed quite a bit because obviously, as Joe Rogan himself said, everybody's getting their information from their phone.
CNN had to run multiple segments analyzing the interview and the influence of the podcast on people. The New York Times published reaction pieces too. Even MSNBC's panelists debated the impact.
But the truth of the matter is, he just doesn't know what he's talking about.
All of the people that sit down for interviews with him, like kind of usher him along, like, you know, like a shepherd does with sheep.
For the first time, a podcaster, not a journalist, was setting the tone of political coverage. The same networks that once ignored Rogan were now hanging onto his every word.
Joe Rogan has had more lives than cats when it comes to changing it up. I grew up seeing Joe Rogan, you know, have people eat testicles of animals and crawl through the darkness when he was doing Fear Factor. Then he did MMA, and now he's doing this. The man, he shapeshifts a lot.
The implications for political campaigns were clear. The old media strategy of using press conferences, TV interviews, scripted debates was losing effectiveness. Politicians now had to engage in real conversations if they wanted to win over voters. The truth is, the days of polished, rehearsed messaging weren't enough anymore. Candidates had to show up, sit down, and talk. And for traditional media, that was a problem. Because if a single podcast could replace an entire industry, where did that leave them? The panic was real. Legacy outlets weren't just losing relevance, they were losing control. The fact that neither Trump nor Harris prioritized the Washington Post over a podcast spoke volumes. News networks were no longer the gatekeepers of political influence. Rogan, and others like him, had taken their place. And whether they liked it or not, politicians were paying attention.
I saw Kamala doing a lot more traditional media. She definitely avoided doing the podcast run. They avoided our podcast. She avoided Rogan. She avoided tons of big podcasts. She went on, a few shows.
The collapse of traditional news dominance wasn't theoretical, it was happening in real time. Mainstream media were hemorrhaging younger viewers. The audience that once tuned in for political analysis was now getting their information from podcasts. And that shift wasn't just about preference, it was about trust. People were done with the polished, corporate-controlled news cycle. They wanted something real, something unfiltered, and Rogan gave it to them.
She went on SNL and they did a sketch. It might be watched by more people than anywhere in the world. Getting people to leave their house to support you is about connection. Legacy media, these TV shows, are not about building connection.
Legacy media's worst nightmare came true when they realized they no longer controlled the national conversation. For decades, they set the narrative. But now, they were being forced to react to the Joe Rogan experience. Every time Rogan had a major guest, the media had to follow. When he interviewed Trump, networks scrambled to cover it. When he discussed COVID policies, fact-checkers went into overdrive. The script had flipped. News outlets weren't leading anymore, they were playing defense. Now here's the real difference. Rogan was unconstrained by business interests or network executives. Unlike television anchors, he did not have producers dictating him what to say. His approach was straightforward. No scripts, no filters, just lengthy discussions. People adored it. Unlike the news, where interviews were cut short after 3 minutes, Rogan allowed discussions to flow. That freedom made him more trustworthy than any news organization. People weren't only listening to Rogan, they believed him. That independence made politicians rethink their media strategy. The old model of carefully crafted talking points wasn't working anymore. Voters wanted to hear politicians speak without teleprompters or scripted answers. That's why Trump's appearance was such a game changer. It showed that real engagement mattered more than traditional media spin. And now every campaign had to adjust. Spotify saw this coming before most people did. Their $200 million deal with Rogan was seen as a massive risk. Critics called it overpriced, but in reality, it was the best media investment of the decade. Rogan's podcast consistently ranked #1 worldwide, drawing millions more listeners than CNN or Fox News could dream of. Spotify wasn't just betting on a podcast, they were betting on the future of media. And they were right. Rogan wasn't just outperforming TV networks, he was replacing them. His reach, influence, and format changed the way people consumed information. Politicians, journalists, and corporations had to adjust or be left behind. The era of media gatekeeping was over, the power had shifted, and for legacy news organizations, there was no going back.
There's another new level of media, which I think is the streamers. They do what radio does. They're on there every day. They're talking with people.
The lies that were sold to us for years was that young people have a very short attention span. In fact, media executives believed people only had the attention span for short, bite-sized content. They pushed headlines, 30-second TikToks, and quick sound bites, convinced that no one would sit through long conversations. Joe Rogan proved them wrong. His podcast, often stretching beyond 3 hours, shattered that myth. When Trump sat down for a conversation that lasted longer than a full-length movie, tens of millions of people didn't just watch a clip, they watched the entire thing. This isn't just about podcasting, it's about trust. A Gallup poll found that only 31% of Americans trust mainstream news. I mean, that's a massive drop from what it used to be. People have grown tired of the heavily filtered, pre-packaged narratives pushed by corporate media. They believe traditional outlets are controlled by political and financial interests, more focused on sensationalism than honest reporting.
These TV shows are not about building connection. They're about selling pharmaceutical ads. That is the goal of the show.
Meanwhile, podcasts offer something different: unfiltered, unedited discussions with no commercial breaks or scripted interruptions. That's why people keep tuning in. Rogan isn't just a podcaster, he's an alternative thought leader. His guests range from scientists and comedians to ex-presidents and controversial figures. If you've paid attention to his podcasts, you would notice that a major key difference: the fact that he doesn't push a corporate-approved narrative. He lets his guests talk. People get to hear different perspectives, something mainstream media actively avoids. This shift is why independent content creators are now more trusted than legacy news outlets. When people want the full story, they don't turn on CNN, they open a podcast app. The impact extends beyond media. The public conversation itself is evolving. The days of one-sided reporting and controlled messaging are coming to an end. More people are engaging in open discussions, especially on controversial issues. With the development of independent voices, no single institution can now control the debate. When someone like Rogan provides a platform for researchers, whistleblowers, or industry experts, the knowledge spreads quickly, whether the mainstream media likes it or not. This new media landscape is reshaping how people think. Instead of passive consumption, audiences are engaging in debates, fact-checking claims, and forming their own opinions. The days of blindly trusting a single news anchor are over. Now, people listen, analyze, and decide for themselves. And the result is a growing distrust in centralized media power and a shift toward decentralized information sources. Podcasts have restored something that long seemed lost: the art of honest conversation. In a world where mainstream news fails to keep viewers interested for more than a few minutes, Rogan's audience sits through hours of discussion. It demonstrates one thing: consumers aren't as distracted as media firms believed. They were just waiting for someone to speak to them, not at them. The power of Rogan's platform isn't just cultural, but also financial. Let me explain. A single mention on his podcast can change the fate of a company overnight. Whether it's a supplement brand, a book, or a fitness product, businesses see instant sales spikes after being discussed on the Joe Rogan Experience. Some companies even struggle to keep up with demand. This phenomenon is so consistent that marketers have coined a term for it: the Rogan Effect. The influence is not limited to product sales. Stock prices of publicly traded corporations have fluctuated solely as a result of Rogan's conversations. A simple mention of a product or business can bring investors scrambling to buy or sell. When he discusses fitness trends, health supplements, or even a particular tech business, the market listens. The financial world now tracks podcasts in the same way that it did newspaper endorsements. This shift is forcing the advertising sector to reconsider its strategies. Traditional television and print advertisements are losing efficacy. People avoid advertisements, block them, or disregard them entirely. But for podcast advertisements, they are different. When Rogan talks about a product, it feels like a friend's advice rather than a prepared sales pitch. That's why firms pay millions of dollars for sponsorships on his show, knowing they'll gain direct access to an audience that genuinely listen. Spotify spotted this opportunity early. That was why they signed Rogan to an exclusive deal worth $200 million, even though critics called it a gamble. But the stats don't lie, because his episodes consistently outperform entire news networks in reach and engagement.
It's going to be another multi-year extension. It's probably going to be an eye-popping number. The last deal was for $200 million for 3 years, although we may not get the details immediately.
Guess what? Advertisers have followed the audience, shifting budgets away from legacy media and toward independent creators. The value of podcast advertising has skyrocketed, and Rogan is at the center of it. The ripple effect goes beyond Rogan himself. His success has inspired thousands of creators to launch their own long-form podcasts. More businesses are recognizing the power of authentic, conversational marketing over traditional ads. The way people consume content is evolving, and corporations are scrambling to adapt. This isn't just about one podcast host earning money. It's about an entire industry being forced to adapt. The media landscape has moved from network-controlled advertising to direct creative sponsorships. As old ad formats diminish, Rogan's approach is emerging as the pattern for the future of digital marketing.
So did he have an impact on the election? Look, I think he probably did. I think he did.
Trump's appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience was a political game changer. You know why? It shattered viewership records and redefined election strategy. In one move, Trump bypassed the mainstream press, spoke directly to tens of millions of voters, and controlled the conversation. This wasn't just a smart campaign decision, it was a shift in how political media works. The panic from legacy media was immediate. CNN, MSNBC, and the Washington Post went into damage control mode. They tried to discredit the interview, attacked Rogan for platforming Trump, and even called for stricter regulations on podcasts. But their efforts only highlighted one thing. They were no longer in control. They weren't leading the conversation. The reaction wasn't just from the media, the public response was just as revealing. Many Rogan listeners who previously dismissed Trump saw a different side of him. Instead of sound bites or staged TV moments, they got 3 hours of unfiltered conversation. For some independent voters, it softened their perception of Trump. The long-form format allowed nuance, something traditional debates and campaign ads fail to provide. This one interview proved something politicians can't ignore. Traditional campaign strategies are outdated. Short TV appearances, press conferences, and social media clips aren't enough anymore. Voters want real conversations. They want to see candidates challenged, not scripted. And they want to hear them speak in their own words, not in rehearsed political slogans. For mainstream media, this was a wake-up call. They no longer hold the monopoly on political influence. Rogan's podcast wasn't just another media platform, it had become the platform. And no amount of damage control could change that. Scientists used to rely on TV interviews and newspaper op-eds to disseminate their findings with the public. However, those platforms only allowed them a few minutes to talk, pushing them to simplify complex topics. Now, more experts are turning to podcasts, particularly the Joe Rogan Experience, to express their ideas without interruptions or biased framing. Whether it's COVID, artificial intelligence, nutrition, or UFOs, Rogan's long-form debates allow specialists to go into the specifics, which traditional media rarely does. Of course, this has not been without controversy. When Rogan invited speakers who questioned established COVID narratives, it created controversy. Critics accused him of promoting falsehoods, and prominent media sources urged Spotify to take action. Unlike typical hosts who collapse under pressure, Rogan stood his ground. He addressed concerns, invited speakers from all sides of the debate, and kept the discussion continuing. The reaction came in waves, but his fans never abandoned him. Spotify found itself in a tricky situation. Some employees wanted the corporation to censor Rogan, but others considered his podcast as too valuable to lose. Finally, Spotify made a deliberate decision. They stood behind Rogan, recognizing that his influence exceeded the temporary outrage. The scandal just increased his influence. Rather than silencing him, the debate increased the popularity of his show. Despite all this, Rogan's ability to withstand cancellation attempts is an important part of his success. It's something we need to study. Unlike traditional media characters who rely on corporate sponsorship, his power is directly derived from his audience. They trust him more than mainstream journalists, and his loyalty renders him almost untouchable. The more detractors attempt to take him down, the stronger he becomes. The way political communication works is changing. If a presidential candidate wants to reach millions of voters, a podcast appearance might be more effective than a televised debate. Trump recognized this early, using Theo Von and Rogan's platform to bypass traditional media gatekeepers. Future candidates, especially those trying to connect with younger audiences, may have no choice but to follow the same path.
If Joe is being honest, big if, then moving forward, there's going to be plenty of things Trump does that he's like, ooh, ugh, I don't know about that one, dog.
The decline of traditional media is becoming harder to ignore. The Washington Post is losing subscribers, CNN is struggling with ratings, trust in major news outlets is at an all-time low. Meanwhile, independent creators are gaining more influence than ever. If this trend continues, newspapers and TV networks might not survive in their current form. The old media model is collapsing in real time. Rogan's success has paved the way for a new generation of independent voices. More creators are launching long-form podcasts, challenging corporate media's grip on information. The question now is, will Rogan remain the king, or will a new voice rise to take his place? The battle between legacy media and independent content isn't over, it's just beginning. Joe Rogan didn't just change podcasting, he changed the entire media landscape. His ability to control the conversation, bring in massive audiences, and challenge traditional narratives has reshaped how people consume information. Trump's interview was the final proof that the balance of power has shifted. The future of influence no longer belongs to TV networks or newspapers, it belongs to whoever can hold the mic the longest. But we have an important question to answer. Do you think Trump's appearance played a major role in swaying people to vote for Trump? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos.